Hello everyone, and welcome back to another instalment of our long-running webinar series. Evolving packaging regulations and stewardship schemes are critical to tackling plastic waste and moving towards a circular economy. To stay ahead of regulatory changes, businesses must adapt their packaging strategies and work together to improve sustainability outcomes. In this webinar, Lynn Mays, Coordinator of the Plastic Packaging Product Stewardship Scheme, and Helen Lewis, Expert in Packaging Sustainability at thinkstep-anz, are discussing regulatory developments in the European Union, Australia and New Zealand, and what that could mean for your business. Let's get into it.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Helen Lewis. I'll be presenting today, and I'm very pleased to have Lynn Mays joining us. Lynn is coordinator of the Plastic Packaging Product Stewardship Scheme and director of MadWorld. And I've known Lynn for quite a while. She's doing an amazing job policy development in New Zealand. Actually, before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge it is NAIDOC week in Australia, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm standing today, Darawal country on the south coast of New South Wales, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm going to cover very briefly some of the new regulations in Europe and Australia, some of the common requirements and what they mean for your business. And then I'll be handing over to Lynn to talk about the developments in New Zealand. There's a lot happening right now, which she'll update us on. So first of all, just some context, what problem are we trying to address? There's increasing recognition that we need to shift to a circular economy, to design out waste, keep materials in circulation for longer at high value, and to regenerate nature. As we know, the economy for packaging is not very circular at the moment. We've got a lot of virgin material coming into the system. In Australia, that's about 60% and about 40% recycled. We have some reuse, mainly in the B2B space. We have a recycling rate of around 56%, but the remainder of packaging is going to landfill. What would a circular economy for packaging look like? We'd see a lot less virgin material coming in. After use, we'd see a lot more reuse in both consumer and B2B packaging. We'd see a much higher recycling rate. And instead of most of it going off into other manufacturing, we'd like to see a lot more going back into packaging, into high value uses. And there are lots of policy levers that can be used. We're talking a bit about regulation today, whether it's design standards, bans, reuse targets, investment in infrastructure, education, recycling targets, recycled content targets. There are lots of levers that can be used, and all of these are being used in the EU and increasingly in Australia and New Zealand. So I'll start with the European Union. The EU and some of their member states have been leaders in packaging stewardship since the 1990s, and a major change is happening this year. So that's what I'm going to briefly talk about. There's more information, actually I should mention, in a white paper that I prepared with colleagues from the Product Stewardship Centre of Excellence and RPS, and that's available on the Product Stewardship Centre website, and I'll try and put a link into the chat box later. So the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive, since 1994, it's put requirements on member states to introduce EPR laws. It introduced essential requirements for design. It set very ambitious targets. There have been a number of problems, including delayed transposition into national law. The essential requirements have been hard to enforce. Not all of the national targets have been met. And increasingly, the EU has also wanted to align the directive with their circular economy goals and their European Green Deal. So the new objectives for the regulation, it's shifting from a directive to a regulation, to prevent the generation of packaging waste, reducing it in quantity and promoting reuse and refill, ensuring that all packaging on the market will be recyclable in an economically viable way by 2030, and increasing the use of recycled material in packaging, enabling high quality closed loop recycling to replace virgin material. Now, most importantly, the regulation is going to be implemented directly, which means that it takes into effect in all EU countries immediately. It doesn't need to be transposed into national law, and that has been one of the problems in the past, with delays and significant differences in the way it's been implemented. So some of the features of the regulation: reduction, bans on additional single-use plastics, such as very lightweight bags and many others. Reduction targets, for example, 5% per capita by 2030, and then higher targets over time. Very interesting in the reuse or refill space, there are quite ambitious targets. For example, transport packaging, 40% to be reusable by 2030. There have been targets for hot and cold beverage containers and takeaway food that have been quite controversial. I'm not sure whether the targets have made it into the final version, but retailers have to allow customers to bring back their own containers for filling, and there has to be a system in place for reuse. Recycling, once again, recycling targets, 70% by 2030. There are different targets for particular materials like plastics, a very high target for single-use metal and plastic containers. Recyclability, this is an interesting area. All packaging to be designed for recycling from 2030, but also collected, sorted and recycled at scale from 2035. So very strict requirements for that. Recycled content also targets based on material and or application. For example, a target there for plastic beverage bottles. Targets for compostable, industrially compostable products. So things like tea and coffee bags, coffee pods, sticky labels on fruit and veg, and so on, to be industrially compostable, not home compostable, but industrially compostable. And I just thought I'd mention the design for recyclability standards, which are particularly interesting. Initially, these are based on the percentage of material that can be recovered from a particular packaging item. And there's 5 grades that you see on the right there. And at the lowest level is 70%. And from 1st of January 2030, packaging will be considered not recyclable if it's under grade E. So if less than 70% of the product can be recovered, it's considered not recyclable and not able to be placed on the market. But from 2035, the requirement is for packaging to be recycled at scale, which means it's effectively collected, sorted, and recycled. So this is really interesting to watch. Those minimum requirements are going to increase over time. So just briefly into Australia before we move on to New Zealand. As many of you know, the Australian framework has 2 components. We call it co-regulatory because it has 2 components. There's the Australian Packaging Covenant, which is an industry-led stewardship scheme being administered by the Australian Packaging Covenant organisation, and the regulatory underpinning, which is the National Environment Protection Measure, which is administered by state and territory governments. And that's always been problematic because different requirements or the implementation of that regulatory underpinning has varied from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Importantly, there is also voluntary packaging targets, which is shown on the right, which shouldn't be new for most of you. Now, these are voluntary requirements for recyclability, recycled content, and elimination of unnecessary single-use plastics, problematic and unnecessary single-use plastics, which are voluntary at the moment. Proposed changes. So environment ministers have announced a number of important changes. The federal government will be the new regulator of packaging standards. They're introducing mandatory design requirements, particularly for recyclability and recycled content. prohibition on the use of harmful substances, industry to be responsible for packaging placed on the market. We're still to find out how that will be interpreted or implemented, and a roadmap for harmonised curbside collections, including for soft plastics. That just was announced with the most recent meeting of ministers. I understand that design guidelines are going to be released towards the end of this year to allow industry time to implement them ahead of the regulatory framework coming into force, and the timeline is still to be confirmed. What this means for your business, just very briefly before I hand over, targets for recyclability are going to become stricter. You need to aim for 100% of the main components of your packaging to be recyclable using something like the PrEP tool, which is in use in Australia and New Zealand to test curbside recyclable packaging. Mandatory targets for post-consumer recycled content. Use post-consumer to improve circularity wherever possible. Regulations to eliminate or reduce single-use plastics coming in and getting stricter. If you want to see what's just around the corner, just have a look at the EU to the long list of products that they've decided to phase out or ban. EPR laws, internationally we're seeing these shifting from voluntary to mandatory, and that's certainly the direction we're going into in Australia. There's also an increasing focus on greenwash. Regulators in both countries are looking to eliminate false or to crack down on false or misleading claims. Take action to stay ahead. I guess that's the key message. This is changing globally, and it's changing in Australia and New Zealand. You need to understand your regulatory and market environment. You need to audit your packaging, identify your priorities, develop targets and strategies. If you're further along the pathway, then certainly developing customised tools that you can build into your design and procurement, marketing, etc. processes to make sure that you're implementing this across the business. If you're taking more of a leading role, if you're well progressed along this pathway, then obviously you could look at using LCA or streamlined tools to compare packaging options to make sure that you're basing your decisions on good information. And if you've got essential but hard to recycle packaging, look to join a scheme or help progress it with your industry peers. So that's just a very brief outline. I will now hand over to Lynn.
Thanks, Helen. And if you move on to so as Helen said, I've been involved for the past couple of years, and indeed before that, with the design of a mandatory plastic product stewardship scheme for New Zealand. And it's followed 4 tranches of work. The first 2 were around identifying the amount of plastic that's placed on the market in New Zealand and how it flows through the system. And it's generally acknowledged that we don't have great data in New Zealand. The New Zealand Food and Grocery Council has been conducting for some years, 4 years now, research into or a survey of its members and others in terms of what they're placing on the market. That's been really valuable. But for non-food and grocery sector plastics, we've really got very little information about what's going on. So that was a piece of work that was conducted by Valpak, which is a UK compliance company. And the steering group leading the project selected Valpak because, as I say, there wasn't a great deal of research available in New Zealand. That then moved on to a 3rd phase of the research, which RPS has led, and Helen was involved in that, and I think Capil is on the line as well, and thanks to both for a really important piece of work done in reviewing international schemes and recommending aspects of those schemes for a scheme design for New Zealand. And the final part of the work is where we currently are, and it's been around RPS have been conducting a cost-benefit analysis of the options identified in the Tranche 3 recommendations, and we're also preparing a scheme design report which is now going to go, just next week, going to start going through its phases of stakeholder engagement. So if we move along onto the next slide, these are the range of aspects that we've been considering in the scheme design process. And I'm not going to go through those in any detail, but you can see that there's a lot of considerations for the design of a scheme. The key area for New Zealand is that the Gazette notice for plastic packaging, plastic packaging was declared a priority product in 2020. That means it requires a mandatory scheme. There was a very specific definition of plastic packaging, which is all plastic, i.e. one through to 7 resins, either singly or in combination with each other or with other materials. So that brings into it plastic lined fiber and materials which are in combination with plastic. And it is to cover all types sold at retail or wholesale. So there has been a considerable piece of work done in what is actually in scope. Out of scope are those containers, drinks containers, which are would go into a container return scheme. And there still has not been a decision in New Zealand as to whether a container return scheme will proceed. But that is out of scope of this project. Also out of scope are agricultural chemicals, which are covered by a separate scheme because farm plastics and agricultural containers are also priority products in their own right. So just moving along onto the next slide, this really encapsulates the data that we've collated in terms of what is placed on the market. So on the left, you've got the tons of plastic placed onto the market. In total, it's estimated that there's 263,000 tons of plastic placed onto the market annually in New Zealand. The areas that are in scope there are in green, and that means in scope of this project. So that's your consumer plastics, either grocery or non-grocery, back of store plastics, and the hospitality sector. CRS there is out of scope, as are agrochemicals, demolition waste, and other materials. The next part of it is what has been recovered through the system. And that is basically around 44,000 tons of plastic has been recovered. And then the next chart shows what is processed onshore and offshore. And the big red blocks on the right-hand side is what we've called lost in system. That's either into the environment or more likely into landfill. So when we talk about, and I think you mentioned, Helen, targets in the EU for 50% recycling rate, we're currently sitting in New Zealand at of total plastic, it will be around 17%. Of our in-scope plastics, it's probably around 19%, but it's not a good look. So the next slide. This is really just a snapshot of how we are perceived, or where our scheme design is looking in comparison to other schemes. So I think the most important thing to note is that the New Zealand scheme is for plastic packaging only. And in RPS's research, and in all of my research and the wider research, we have not yet come across a scheme in the world where they are only looking at one material. Schemes are generally for all packaging materials. That's not to say there aren't taxes that are placed on plastic, there are, but in terms of EPR schemes, they all tend to have or address all of packaging. That means they're larger and they've got bigger volumes. So our volume, in terms of the 135,000 tons or thereabouts of plastic packaging, places us in comparison with schemes under stewardship such as Bulgaria, Cyprus, or Macedonia. And our aspirations are really to be Belgium, Ireland, or the Netherlands. So we are trying to punch above our weight, but we actually have got a relatively small in-scope materials. There's also, as I've mentioned, we've got other packaging stewardship schemes, being the container return scheme, should that arise, and also the ag recovery schemes. It's very clear that we've got large gaps in onshore processing infrastructure. And what we have said, and I know just talking with the teams at the Australian Food and Grocery Council who are working on designs of stewardship schemes for Australia, the importance of us aligning where we can across our two countries, because as Helen mentioned earlier, the EU is tackling their issues as a region, a very large region. And in the EU, you have market access across all of those countries, including for your waste. So waste can travel across borders, just as there is freedom of movement for people, there's freedom of movement for waste. And so when we look at our waste situation and we're looking at a small island or two islands down on the other side of the world with a relatively small population, and whilst we've got a lot of plastic, it's frankly not enough to justify some of the major infrastructure, that presents us with a challenge. So the other piece that we've really come to understand is that the introduction of a scheme for only plastic packaging will see producers take on the cost of the curbside collection. So under a producer pays scheme, the producer takes on the costs relating to the collection, sortation and reprocessing of plastic. So that moves the costs away from the ratepayers or the councils. But of course, the ratepayer and the councils will still need to collect the glass and the metal and the fibre from the curbside. So whilst we might anticipate that we'd never ever see rate reductions, if the producers were taking on the responsibility for all of packaging, those rates could be spent on something else, transport, potholes, whatever. But actually, we're still going to see that the councils are still going to fulfill their role as collecting those other materials, whilst the costs will shift onto producers. But what we do see is the introduction of an EPR scheme for New Zealand does offer huge potential for moving our waste up the hierarchy, to reduce what we place on the market, to design our packaging better, and also to align with Te Maori frameworks, which really do get to the heart of how we manage waste. So there's a great opportunity for us, but there's a lot of challenges to be overcome as well. So what I would say is if you haven't already registered, and I know quite a few people have, if you haven't registered, do hop onto the ppps.org.nz website. There is a link there to briefing sessions. There will be 4 coming up. The first one starts on Monday. There's 2 that are aimed directly at producers. There's 1 that's aimed more at the council's waste management reprocessors, and there's a generic one. And that will be a briefing session bringing people up to a level of engagement and knowledge about what the scheme design looks like and how they can input into it. So please do register if you haven't. And that is over and out from me, Helen.
Brilliant. Good, on time. Thank you, Lynn. We've just got time for a few questions, and I might start with one for you from Keith. With fibre and plastics, are there limits on the percentage of plastic by weight on fibre in the requirement? Has that been defined?
It hasn't, and it's problematic. So we've had a number of technical advisory groups looking at this and trying to land on what a percentage might be. And also if there is a percentage, so let's say, and this is by no way a number that's in play, but if we said that the number was 5%, if you have got over 5%, so you've got, do you then pay on the 100% of your packaging, or do you pay on just the percentage that's the plastic? So that's not resolved. It's part of a bigger discussion in New Zealand, and I believe it's happening in Australia as well, about fibre thresholds and what can be labelled as recyclable and what is not typically accepted for recycling. So the answer is no, we haven't, and it's something that we do need to look at. What we have been recommending is that we do know, for example, that cans have got a plastic coating. We have made the assumption that it was not the intention of the government to include plastic linings or coatings on a food can as being part of the scheme.
And of course, that's why it's so difficult when it's a plastics only scheme rather than a packaging only scheme. Just a couple of other questions here. One from Sahar. How will these mandates work for medical devices and highly regulated plastic containers that have, this is talking about the EU, and highly regulated plastic containers that have limitations for either use of recycled content and contamination preventing recyclers accepting it? Interestingly, they have got a lot of sort of sub-targets in the regulation, so it's worth having a look. They do have different targets, for example, for food contact packaging and pharmaceutical products versus others. So they have gone through a pretty long consultation process to work out how to make this workable. And of course, we'll face the same issues in Australia if recycled content targets become mandatory. How are they applied to different categories where, you know, products like beverage containers can use up to 30% or 50% or 80%, and others currently can't use any or can only use small quantities. So yeah, the regulations do have a lot of sub-targets for particular categories. Other question, from Keith, will the EU regulation for compostable packaging require certification? That's certainly my understanding, and it's industrially compostable, not home compostable. A lot of the detail will be published separately in, I think they'll be implemented through separate acts and guidelines. And I know there's a lot of work happening at the moment on plastics. So I think we'll see more detail come out, but that's my understanding. Have we got time for one quick one? I will get back. Ian Olmsted, interesting to learn more about the New Zealand scheme. Very much agree with the need to consider how best to optimise recycling capability across ANZ and further to give economies of scale. Do you have any thoughts on how Australia and New Zealand could begin to approach that now? Lynn, there's a big question for you, working across the region.
It is a big question, and it's something we have been doing. So in the project team that's been, so the project team and the co-leaders of the project are the Packaging Forum and the New Zealand Food and Grocery Council, and obviously the project is co-funded with money from the Waste Minimisation Fund. But in the project team, we have also included the team from the Australian Food and Grocery Council, precisely to try and see where we can align what's going on, both in terms of the scheme designs and also understanding the policy settings on both sides and where those economies of scale might sit, for example, in terms of the way we collect data or ultimately collect fees and levies. So yes, not sure we've got the answer, but we're certainly looking at it.
One last one, which might be quick for you, Lynn. Will it be the packaging producer or the brand owner responsible for collecting packaging for recycling? Who's the liable party?
The liable party is the producer, and the producer is defined as the brand owner, the person that's placing the product on the market. That could also be the importer, where that is going direct to a customer.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lynn. And unfortunately, we've run out of time. These are very short and sweet, these webinars. We will try to get back to you with those outstanding questions. So thanks for popping them in the Q&A box. Thanks once again to Lynn for taking time to join us in a very busy time for you and the PPPS. And thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. Have a good rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
We have many more webinars on our website on a whole host of sustainability topics.